What if I told you that art and design wasn't a luxury, but rather something that's essential to living a better life? An emerging field of science known as neuroaesthetics is now exploring the ways in which viewing beauty or interacting with beauty actually changes our mental states. Something as simple as viewing a beautiful sunset has actually been shown to lower cortisol and take you from a fight or flight state into a parasympathetic state. Growing evidence even shows strong connections to gratitude. So going for a walk, stopping to smell the flowers, or enjoying something that you find beautiful actually releases dopamine in our brains. I am not a neuroscientist, but I will be following this research closely because it may just prove what I've always believed, that our spaces have a significant effect on our mental health, personal identity, and sense of meaning. During my research, I came across a study from UPenn where participants were put in 3 separate environments and took a series of tests. I will link the study, and if you're interested, you're more than welcome to look through the results yourself, but I am going to walk through some of their findings. The 3 environments shown are the 3 environments that were used for the study. The first space that they used as the control room is probably what you might imagine as the typical 9-to-5 corporate office. It has no windows, some bad overhead lighting, and no decoration whatsoever. The second space, known as the biophilic space, was one of the test spaces. They tried to decorate the space so that it more closely emulated nature. There's a carpet with some organic design. They have, I believe, tiki or bamboo on the ceiling to help diffuse light. And then they have a large green wall off to the one side, as well as a small plant on the tabletop. The last space was a natural space. They took people out into a natural setting, I believe a park, and they did the same tests on a laptop that's placed on their lap. Now here are the actual results. So off to the left, you can see there's 3 different kind of scoring systems here. And all of this scoring system is self-reported. So the participants gave the researchers a number, and those numbers were recorded on a scale of 1 to 7. And all of these numbers are based on the aesthetics of the space. The 3 different rating systems were coherence, which meant control and order of the space, fascination, which was general interest in the visuals of the space, and hominess is kind of the coziness or comfort of the space. Again, these were self-reported. They gave a number on a scale of 1 to 7, and these are the results. The control room is in red, the biophilic room is blue, and nature is green here. Now, looking at the chart, we can easily see that both the biophilic and the natural environment scored higher in aesthetic ratings than the control room, which I don't think is a huge surprise that people don't love being stuck in a white box. But what they did is then they took these scores for aesthetics and overlaid them with cognitive creativity tests. Now the study labeled this as divergent thinking. And divergent thinking and creative ability are not necessarily the same thing. Divergent thinking simply means the ability to think about a vast number of options or uses for a single item. So essentially, if you have one problem, how many different solutions can you come up with to the problem? Really more about diversity of thought than necessarily creative function of thought. But after they went through all these tests, what they found is that there was a significant difference in the scores for divergent thinking from the natural group. So there was not a significant difference from the control room to the biophilic room, but there was a significant difference from both of those spaces to nature. Now, why the biophilic room didn't score as high on the divergent scale as the natural environment did, it did show to increase the participants' mood. So there was a difference emotionally between the control room, the biophilic room, and the natural environment. One of the things I do find sort of interesting about this study is that all the information was somewhat self-reported. So all of the aesthetic ratings are self-reported, and then the divergent thinking tests were somewhat limited in scope. Personally, I was hoping that there would be brain scans to go along with these tests so that the researchers could see which areas of the brain were lighting up when they were just in this space versus when they were actually completing an activity in this space, because I think attention is also important in these studies. I also found it interesting when I was reading through that one of the researchers, or it was pointed out in their findings, that hominess scales might have increased or comfort scores might have increased if there were personal items within the biophilic room, some point of connection. Now that I've kind of gone over the research with you, I want to talk about really specifically the differences in design from the biophilic room to the control room. So I do not specialize in biophilic design, but if you quickly Google what this means, you'll get a pretty basic definition, which is as seen on screen. So an architectural and design concept that seeks to connect building occupants with the natural environment by incorporating elements like natural light, fresh air, plants, water, natural elements, and views of nature. If I am looking at the biophilic room from a definitional standpoint alone, I believe that the design has failed. So while I'm not a researcher, it's very clear to me that the people who put together this study are not designers. I do not know the limitations of this study because it seems like to really test the difference between the control and not control space, they still wanted to use the control room. However, the control room has no natural light, there is no window, and therefore no fresh air, and there is also no water source. And I actually think it would have been very easy to put a small fountain on the desk to kind of emulate the water source. So by definition alone, I think the research failed to actually emulate a biophilic space. Now, from strictly a design perspective, I almost sort of laughed when I first saw the space because neuroaesthetics is the study of beauty on the brain. But I don't know how many people would actually consider this space beautiful. I think they took it a little too literally. I do see natural elements. They brought in wood. They brought in plants. They brought in natural elements. But I think the focus was too heavily on just the materials of what was in the space. One of the first things that I noticed is that there's 3 competing focal points. We have a very busy rug. We have the green wall directly in front of you as you walk into the space. And then we have all this bamboo or tiki torches, I don't know, covering the ceiling. So immediately as you enter into the space, your brain, your eyes are darting around the room because there's not a centralized focal point, which is important in design. But it's important because it creates a sense of stability or grounding in this space. If my eyes are darting from the ceiling to the wall to the floor, my brain is scattered. I'm trying to take in all the information instead of calmly scanning the space from element to element. When you hear someone talk about a really well thought out design or a really sophisticated layered design, they'll often describe the experience of going into the space and feeling very cozy and calm, but that they start to notice more things over time. So maybe something immediately grabs their attention, but then the next time they're in the space or the longer they're in the space, they start to slowly notice different elements within the room, which is the difference between sort of being very intentional about the way you're directing attention and unintentionally creating multiple focal points. Now, why does this matter in a biophilic design? Well, one of the common elements found in nature is balance. And if you're going to emulate the natural environment, it inherently has to feel balanced, which I think is really where this room failed from the start. The second big problem I see with the space is that of all the things they added, they neglected the space directly above the computer screen. So I want you to imagine that you were the person in this study. You walk through the door, and this is exactly what you see. We see the rug, we see the wall, we see all the stuff going on in the ceiling. You enter the space, and then you sit down at the chair, and you get comfortable to do the test on the laptop. If you are sitting in that chair, you are not seeing any of the rug underneath you. You have to turn your head to see the green wall, or turn your head directly above you to see the ceiling. So any small movements that you might do when you're actually working don't have a natural element. Even the small plant is at the very far edge of the desk. So the minute the person sat down and got comfortable and started actually performing these activities or tests on the computer, they're completely ignoring the rest of the environment because they're now trying to focus on that screen. And anything that would come up in their peripheral. So you can think about when you're working at a computer, you start to get tired, you need a minute, your eyes drift off to the side. Typically your head does not drift with you, just your gaze drifts. So anything immediately in this area around the laptop where your gaze might naturally drift has no natural element within it. The last thing I found interesting about this space is that the feng shui, now again, not my area of expertise, but I have done some basic general research. This setup, your desk facing a totally solid wall, is a great setup for focus. It is not a great setup, however, for creativity or openness. It doesn't support expansion of thought or visibility. It promotes focus. So again, the desk is set up in a way that works against our brains in terms of creativity, at least from a feng shui standpoint. And you can kind of take it or leave it based on your thoughts about feng shui. But it is an interesting thing, I believe, to tie in because, again, a lot of their principles are based off examinations of nature. Their principles come from things they have found in natural environments. After helping people design spaces for the last decade, what I can tell you is that nature or natural elements is a common request that people ask for, but their definition varies from person to person on what nature essentially they're attracted to. Some people just really love the color green. Some people tend to move towards blue because it reminds them of the ocean. And some people just want you to put a plant in every room. What I find interesting as a designer is not that we're inherently attracted to natural elements, but rather that we almost self-select what counts as natural. What's interesting is what most people consider natural or earthy tends to be brown, green, terracotta, and sometimes blue, when objectively all colors are found in nature. It just so happens that those colors are found in the largest amounts. So if you think about the pure space of how much room grass takes up and how much room the sky takes up versus something small like a purple flower, the scale is different. Another observation I've seen working with clients is that the clients who live in tropical areas or areas that experience less variation in season are much less likely to request natural elements in their space. So for example, I worked with a family in California that had the most beautiful views I've ever seen out their window. I mean, actually stunning. and everything they did in their house was in certain jewel tones and patterns that are not typically found in nature. It was almost a juxtaposition between the two extremes. However, when I work with someone up north who experiences 6 to 8 months of winter, they are very likely to tell me that natural or earthy elements as one of the first things that they want to incorporate in their space. So it seems to me that the more opportunity you have to go out and just be in nature, the less likely you will be to try and emulate in your space. But that also means that if you live somewhere that you don't have that opportunity, it becomes more important to emulate it and emulate it well in your space. Now, you might be wondering what all of this has to do with you and what it has to do with increasing your creative capacity. But what this study shows conclusively is that going outside and being in nature significantly, by statistical standards, increases your divergent thinking, which means that simply going outside heightens your ability for creativity. So here are some ways that I think we can practically use that research. If you are struggling with a problem at work, it suggests that taking 15 minutes to go for a walk outside in a park around the block will actually help you think more creatively about the problem. If you find yourself stuck or your mind running in circles, again, it can help to move to a natural environment, lower your cortisol levels, and come back to a regulated state. If you are interested in increasing your capacity for creativity, it suggests that starting a weekly routine like going for a walk or meditating outside or just generally spending time in nature can increase our divergent thinking. Now you might be thinking, great, but I'm one of those people who lives in an area that it's not exactly exciting to go for a walk when it's negative 12 degrees outside. And I hear you. I grew up in Ohio and I spent 8 to 10 months of the year trapped inside because there was nothing exciting or enticing to look at outside. And for those people, I would say I would try some of these practical tips for inside your space. So maybe you move your desk next to a window. Maybe you open the window even when it's cold outside for a couple minutes just to kind of circulate some air. Maybe you get a small plant that you find really beautiful and put it next to your computer or workspace. While the research didn't show that the biophilic rooms significantly increased people's divergent thinking, it did show that it significantly increased their mood, which still has the potential to put you in a better state and a better state for the capacity to then be creative. If we take these results at face value alone, it suggests that spending time outside actually significantly increases your ability for creativity. However, what I find most compelling about this study is that it scientifically proves that there is a difference in your mental state and mood based on your environment alone, which suggests to me that ultimately changing your space can actually change your mind. As I mentioned earlier, I personally believe that the biophilic room failed because it didn't inherently embrace the common themes found in nature. They focused heavily on physical things like wood and plants, but not the emotional experience that comes from being in nature. In next week's episode, I'm going to break down how most of the design rules most artists use are actually derived from nature, and how I believe that we could have changed this room to better reflect those qualities. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. It is my very first podcast, and my hope is that you feel inspired to make everyday changes in your life to live a more beautiful, fulfilling, and uplifting experience. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please subscribe or send it to a friend. I am brand new at this. You can also find me on TikTok and Instagram under the handle name The Study of Space. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next week.